The wind came before the snow. Greer Calloway felt it first in his knuckles, the way the cold wrapped around each joint like a slow tightening fist. He stood on the porch of his cabin at 4 in the morning, a cup of coffee steaming in his right hand, and watched the darkness shift over the western ridge. The pines were moving wrong, not swaying the way they did in ordinary wind, but stiffening, pulling tight against themselves like living things bracing for impact. Scout stood beside him. The German shepherd had not made a sound. He simply appeared at the door when Greer opened it, pressed himself to the left side of Greer's leg, and fixed his gaze on something out beyond the tree line. His ears were forward. His breathing was slow and deliberate. His tail hung still. Greer did not rush him. He had learned long ago that Scout knew things before they arrived. Not in any way that could be explained or written in a report, just in the way that some creatures are tuned differently to the world, picking up frequencies no human instrument could measure. Greer trusted that. He trusted it more than he trusted most things. He took a long sip of coffee and looked where Scout was looking. The western sky was wrong. The stars there had vanished behind something large and moving, a wall of clouds so dark it looked like the mountain itself had begun to slide sideways across the horizon. The temperature had already dropped since he stepped outside. He could feel it changing in real time, pulling warmth out of the air, the way a drain pulls water fast and indifferent. "Storm," he said quietly, not to himself, to Scout. Scout did not look up. He kept his eyes on the west and exhaled a single slow breath that fogged white in the darkness. Greer finished his coffee, set the empty cup on the railing, and stood there another 2 minutes. He had spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL learning how to read environments that wanted to kill him. Terrain, weather, human behavior. The 1,000 small signals that a place gives off before something terrible happens. He had been good at it, better than most. He had brought men home who should not have come home, and he had kept teams alive through conditions that had no right to allow survival. He had also lost 2 men in a building in Kandahar because he had ignored his own instincts. He did not think about that every morning. Some mornings he went several hours before it surfaced, but it always surfaced the way something heavy thrown into deep water always eventually finds its way back up. He had made a call. He had been certain. The building had looked clear. The signals he noticed but dismissed were not dismissed for any good reason, only because certainty felt cleaner than doubt in the moment, and he had always preferred clean. 2 men did not come home. He bought the cabin on the Colorado High Plateau 8 months after his discharge. He told no one it was a punishment. He told himself it was rest. The nearest town, Ridgecrest, sat 7 miles down the mountain road, a place of maybe 400 people, hardware stores and feed shops, and a diner that served the same 3 things every day of the year. He drove down when he needed supplies. He spoke when spoken to. He returned to the ridge before dark. The cabin was old, built in the 50s by someone who understood wood and stone, but not much else. It had 1 fireplace, 1 chimney, 2 rooms, and a porch that faced east, so the morning light came in low and flat across the floorboards. Greer had repaired what needed repairing and left the rest as it was. He did not want the place to feel like his. He was not sure how long he intended to stay. Scout had been with him for 16 months. Greer had found him at a shelter in Colorado Springs during the drive up, stopped without planning to walk inside, and found a 4-year-old German shepherd sitting in the back of the last kennel with a deep scar along his left shoulder and eyes that did not ask for anything. The dog had been returned twice. The intake form said he did not trust easily. Greer signed the papers the same afternoon. They had figured each other out slowly, the way 2 people who have both been through something do, not by talking about it, but by existing near each other until the presence itself became a kind of language. Scout slept at the foot of the bed. He walked the perimeter of the property each morning. He did not bark unless it mattered. That morning, standing on the porch in the dark with the storm building in the west, Scout growled once, low, brief, and then silent again. Greer looked at him. The dog was still watching the tree line, but something had shifted in his posture. Less the stillness of anticipation and more the stillness of recognition, as though whatever was coming had just crossed some invisible threshold that only Scout could see. "Let's go in," Greer said. They went inside. Greer banked the fire and added 2 fresh logs. The flames took quickly, and within minutes, the front half of the cabin was warm. He moved to the small kitchen and started another pot of coffee, listening to the wind pick up outside, listening to the first whisper of snow begin to scrape against the windows. Dex Paulson was asleep in the far corner. Greer looked at him for a moment. The man was buried under two wool blankets, his boots placed neatly beside the wall, his coat folded over the top of his pack, the way soldiers folded things out of habit precisely without thinking. Even unconscious Dex looked like a man who was trying to take up as little space as possible. They had served together for 4 years. Dex was 3 years older, a quiet man from eastern Montana who spoke slowly and thought before he spoke, and never said anything he did not mean. He had been the kind of person whose steadiness made the people around him steadier. Greer had trusted him in the field the way you only trust someone after you have both been afraid in the same place at the same time and neither of you broke. Dex had called 3 weeks ago. The connection was bad satellite phone cutting in and out, but the shape of the conversation came through clearly. The company in Denver had folded. There was no severance. His wife of 9 years had left in October, taking their daughter, and Dex was sleeping on a friend's couch trying to figure out what came next. He was not asking for anything. He was just calling because there was no one else left to call. Greer told him to come up. He had arrived 2 days ago in a truck that needed new tires, carrying a bag that was not full enough for the weather. Greer had given him a pair of his own thermal socks in the better of the two sleeping bags without making anything of it. They had spent the first evening the way old soldiers spend evenings, not talking about what mattered, circling around it with stories from before the ones that were safe enough to tell. Dex had laughed at something Greer said about a training exercise in Virginia, a real laugh, and for a moment the weight that sat on his face lifted, and he looked like the man Greer remembered. Scout had taken to him immediately, spent the evening with his head resting on Dex's knee, which was unusual. Scout was careful with people he did not know, but whatever he looked for in a person, he had found it in Dex Paulson within an hour. Greer poured his coffee and sat in the chair by the fire and let the storm come. He fell asleep there without meaning to, the cup still warm in his hand. He woke to Scout, not to sound. The dog had not barked. Greer woke because Scout was standing directly in front of him, close enough that Greer could feel the warmth coming off his coat, and the dog's body was rigid in a way that reached something instinctive in Greer, something underneath thought. He was awake fully and immediately the way he had trained himself to wake in the field without the slow drag of confusion just present. Scout was facing the far corner of the cabin, the corner where Dex was sleeping. Greer looked. In the gray early light coming through the frost-edged windows, he could see the shape of Dex under the blankets still and quiet. The fire had burned low but was not out. The cabin was warm near the hearth, the air thick with the smell of pine ash and old wood. But Scout would not move toward the corner. He stood at the edge of the fire's light and stared, and the low sound that came from his chest was not aggression and it was not fear. It was something older than either of those things. Greer set down the cup and crossed the room. He noticed the temperature change before he reached the halfway point, not the gradual coolness of moving away from a fire. Something sharper, something that landed differently on the skin, a drop so sudden it felt structural, as though the air itself had a wall built through the middle of it. By the time he reached the corner, his breath was coming out white. He looked at the wall. The logs there on the inside of the cabin were coated in a thin shell of ice. Not frost, ice. The kind that forms on the outside of things left in the cold, not on interior walls of a structure with a fire burning 6 feet away. He knelt beside Dex. He said his name once, then again. He put his hand on Dex's shoulder through the blankets and felt what he felt and understood it immediately because he had felt it before. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of Dex's neck and held them there for a long time, long enough that there was no question. He sat back on his heels. Behind him, Scout had come as far as the edge of the cold zone and stopped there. The dog was watching Greer's face. Greer did not move for a long time. He was aware of the fire crackling behind him, aware of the storm outside pressing against the walls, aware of the ice on the logs 2 feet from his face, and the heat of the flames 6 feet at his back. Both of those things true at the same time in a space that should not have allowed both to be true. He did not think about the mission in Kandahar right then. He thought about Dex's laugh from 2 nights ago, about the way the man had folded his coat with the same precision he had used folding everything for as long as Greer had known him, about a couch in Denver and a phone call with bad satellite reception and a voice trying very hard not to sound like it was asking for help. He reached out and folded the top of the blanket down with care, smoothing it across Dex's chest. He sat there for an hour, Scout eventually crossed into the cold zone and lay down beside Greer, pressing his flank against Greer's leg. The dog did not growl anymore. He simply stayed. When Greer finally reached for the radio on the shelf above the door, he made the call. In a steady voice, gave the location, answered the questions he was asked. He set the radio down and sat back in the chair by the fire. The storm was still going. Snow was coming under the door in thin white threads. He picked up his field notebook from the shelf, opened to the first blank page. He wrote one word: why? Then he underlined it. He looked at the corner, at the ice on the interior logs, at the dead air that sat between him and the spot where a fire should have been enough. His mind had already started moving. He spent the rest of that morning working methodically and without stopping, because stopping would have meant sitting still with only the thing he could not change. And he had learned long ago that he could either grieve or he could move. And moving was how he had survived everything before this. He would grieve later. He always did. But first he needed to understand. He filled 4 metal cups with water and placed them at each of the 4 corners of the cabin. Then he pulled thin strips of cloth from an old shirt and held them at different heights and positions throughout the room, watching how they moved or did not move. Near the fireplace, the cloth fluttered steadily upward, pulled by the heat rising into the chimney. In the corners, the cloth hung absolutely still. Not just still, dead. The air in the corners was not moving at all. It was not being disturbed by the heat from the fire. It was not being reached by it. The warmth was rising straight up, collecting above the fire, pressing against the ceiling, and escaping through the chimney while the 4 corners of the room sat in their own sealed pockets of cold. Scout followed him from station to station. At each corner, the dog lowered his nose and inhaled slowly, then backed away. He was reading the same thing Greer was reading, just with different instruments. Greer crouched in the corner where Dex had slept and pressed his palm flat against the log wall. The cold came through his skin immediately, a bone-deep pull that felt nothing like the ordinary chill of touching wood. This was something else. This wall was not just cool from the outside temperature bleeding through. It was actively cold. Cold in a way that was moving inward, drawing heat out of anything that came close to it. He moved to the opposite corner and pressed his palm to that wall too. Same thing. Different degree, but the same fundamental wrongness. He sat back against the central support beam and looked at the ceiling. Above the fireplace, the air shimmered faintly with heat. He could almost see it, the invisible column rising from the flames, climbing straight up and disappearing into the stone chimney. It was efficient in one direction. It was completely useless in every other direction. He wrote in the notebook for 20 minutes, drew rough diagrams, mapped the positions of each cup, each cloth strip, each wall, noted the temperature his body registered at each location, marked the corners with a different symbol than the rest. Dead zones, he wrote. Then below it, heat goes up. Cold settles. If air doesn't move, it becomes a trap. He stared at what he had written. Then he wrote, Dex, I'm going to find out how to stop this. 3 days after that, when the storm had pulled back enough to open the road, Greer came down the mountain. Ridgecrest in winter had the feel of a place conserving itself. Everything pulled inward. Storefronts, quiet trucks left running in parking lots, so the engines would not freeze people moving between buildings, with the efficient purpose of people who have long since stopped having patience for anything that was not necessary. The town had been here since the 1890s. It had outlasted a dozen economic downturns and 3 catastrophic winters in the slow disappearance of the logging industry that had once been its purpose. What remained was lean and functional, and not particularly interested in new ideas. Greer drove his truck to Petra Owens's hardware store and parked in the lot beside a stack of firewood that reached the height of the storefront window. The bell above the door rang when he entered. Petra was behind the counter, a woman in her mid-50s with gray hair cut short and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the general expression of someone who has run a small business long enough to be suspicious of anyone she does not recognize and tolerant of anyone she does. She recognized Greer. They had spoken maybe 15 times in 2 years. She had always treated him with the flat, efficient courtesy of someone who respected his desire to be left alone. She gave him a nod. He moved through the store picking up what he needed: metal sheeting, stone mortar, several lengths of heat-resistant piping, a chisel set. He placed each item on the counter and she scanned them without commentary until she reached the piping. 4 sections, she said. Yes. She looked at the stack of items, then at him, then back at the items. She did not ask. He was reaching for his wallet when the door opened and Vern Brimslow came in. Greer had seen Vern twice from a distance and once up close at the gas station 2 months ago, a brief exchange of nods that counted as conversation in Ridgecrest. Vern was 58 and built like a man who had spent 4 decades doing physical work and never given his body permission to slow down. He had a red and gray beard, thick forearms, and the deliberate way of moving that comes from years of working around machinery and timber and knowing that carelessness costs. He was the most respected man in the valley. Greer had understood that the first time he drove through town. Some people carry their standing in a community the way they carry their name naturally without display, and Vern was that kind of person. Behind Vern came the Dunbar brothers. Croft was the older one, 35 or so, broad and loud in the physical sense, always in motion, always close to a grin. Ledge was younger by 3 years and quieter, but watched everything and said exactly what he thought when he decided to speak, which meant that when he spoke, people listened. They were loggers, 3rd generation, and they wore the confidence of men who believed they understood the mountain better than anyone who had not grown up on it. Vern stopped when he saw the items on Petra's counter. His eyes moved over the metal sheeting, the piping, the mortar, and then came to rest on Greer's face. Greer looked back at him and said nothing. Croft Dunbar leaned around his brother and looked at the counter with the expression of a man who has spotted something worth commenting on. "That's an unusual order for February," Croft said. Greer did not respond. Vern said quieter than Croft, "What are you building up there, Calloway?" It was not a question. It was the particular inflection of a man who already had a partial answer and was deciding whether he wanted the rest of it. "Heat distribution system," Greer said. "Fire isn't reaching the corners. I'm going to change how the airflow works. 4 chimneys, 1 central firebox." Ledge Dunbar straightened slightly. Croft looked at his brother. 4 chimneys, Croft said. He let the number sit in the air the way you let something sit when you want everyone around you to hear how strange it sounds. Vern did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the items on the counter, and something moved across his face that was not amusement. Something more complicated than that. He said, "Can we talk outside?" Greer paid for his items first. Petra put everything in 2 heavy paper bags without a word, but when he picked them up, she held his gaze for just a second longer than necessary, and whatever she was thinking stayed behind her eyes. Outside, the cold hit immediately, the kind of dry mountain cold that did not feel dramatic until your skin started to ache. Vern had walked to the far edge of the lot, away from the door, away from the windows. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and waited for Greer to reach him. Then Vern Brimslow said something that Greer had not expected. He said, "I need to tell you something before you go any further with this." His voice had changed. The authority was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, something that sounded older and less certain. 20 years ago, Vern said, "My younger brother came up from Cheyenne with a head full of ideas about improving mountain cabins. He was an engineer by training, smart in the way that sometimes makes a person believe they can outthink things that don't need outthinking. He had a plan for a new kind of heat distribution. One had to retrofit his place up near the North Ridge." Vern looked out toward the mountains. "I was the only one who encouraged him," he said. "Everyone else told him it was a bad idea. I told them they were afraid of anything new. I helped him source materials. I drove up on weekends and helped him lay stone. I believed in him." He stopped. Then he said the system he built was never completed. He got most of the way through, but there were sections that weren't sealed. He was going to finish in the spring. That January, there was a cold snap, and he tried to use what he had so far. Something in the unfinished section failed. A joint cracked. Hot gas found dry timber. The cabin caught fire in the middle of the night. Greer stood still. His wife, Vern, said. His little girl, she was 4 years old. The wind moved through the parking lot and lifted a small spiral of snow off the hood of a nearby truck and scattered it. "I am not telling you that you are wrong," Vern said. "I'm telling you that I stood where you're standing once, and I was certain, and my certainty cost 3 people everything they had. I don't know how to look at what you're doing without seeing that, and I don't know how to stay quiet about it." Greer listened to all of it. Then he said, "I understand." He meant it. He understood exactly. He had his own version of that story, and it lived in a building in Kandahar and came back to him most mornings before the coffee was finished. He understood what it was to be certain when certainty was not enough. He picked up his bags. "A man died in my cabin 3 days ago," he said. "He was asleep 6 feet from a burning fire. The corners of the room were freezing while the center was warm. That shouldn't be possible, and it is, and I'm not going to leave it alone." He looked at Vern directly. "I'm not your brother," he said, "and I'm not going to rush this." He walked to his truck, put the bags in the back, and drove up the mountain. He worked for the rest of that day and through the evening and into the next morning. The first trench took 6 hours to dig. The frozen ground did not give easily. He swung the pickaxe until his shoulders gave out, and then he rested for 20 minutes and started again. Scout stayed close throughout moving, when Greer moved lying down at the edge of the work, when Greer was stationary, never far enough away that Greer could not see him. The plan was laid out across 4 pages of the notebook. He had drawn it and redrawn it until the logic was clean. One central firebox positioned at the middle of the cabin, 4 channels running beneath the floorboards, one toward each corner. 4 stone columns rising in the corners, each one a chimney, each one drawing heat from the central source and radiating it outward into the dead zones. The system was not complicated in concept. It was complicated in execution, in the precision of the joints, in the angle of the channels, and the balance of the draw between the 4 outlets. He had done harder things with fewer resources in worse conditions. He thought of Dex while he worked, not constantly, not in a way that stopped him, but in the background, the way a sound sits in a room even when you stop focusing on it. He thought about the folded coat, the phone call, the laugh. He thought about what it meant that a man could die in a warm room because warmth had failed to find him, and he thought that this was perhaps how a lot of men ended, not in dramatic failure, but in the quiet failure of something that should have been simple, some basic protection that should have been enough and wasn't. That night, the storm returned with more intention than before. The wind found every gap in the cabin walls and probed them. Snow pressed against the windows until the glass went opaque. The temperature outside dropped to levels that made the walls groan. Greer was on his knees in the second trench when Scout moved. Not slowly, all at once, the full body shift of a dog who has registered something physical in the immediate environment. He was on his feet and 2 steps toward Greer. Before Greer heard the sound, a deep crack from somewhere above him, the specific sound of wood that has been under load for a long time finally giving way. He did not think. He rolled. The crossbeam came down where he had been kneeling. It hit the floor with a concussion that he felt in his chest. Splinters scattered across his forearms and cheek. Scout had collided with him in the roll. The dog had hit him from the right side with his full body weight, which was what had moved Greer far enough. Now Scout was on 3 legs holding his left front paw off the floor. Greer sat up and reached for him immediately. Scout let him touch the paw. The leg below the knee was already swelling. Not broken as far as Greer could tell, but the soft tissue had taken impact. Scout stood on it, experimentally tested his weight, and then held it up again. Greer sat on the floor with him for a while. He wrapped the paw with strips from the same shirt he had used for the airflow tests, working carefully, keeping the pressure even. Scout did not flinch. He watched Greer's hands and then watched Greer's face with the patient attention of a creature who has decided completely to trust one particular human and is at peace with that decision. "You should rest that," Greer said. "I mean it. Stay by the fire." Scout allowed himself to be guided to the hearthside. He circled once and lay down. But when Greer picked up the pickaxe again, Scout raised his head and tracked every movement with those pale gold eyes, and the growl that came from him when the wind particularly battered the walls was low and steady and protective. Greer worked until he could not lift his arms. Then he sat down on the floor with his back against the warm central stones of the old fireplace and looked across the room at the 4 empty corners. He thought about what Vern Brimslow had said in the parking lot. He thought about a 4-year-old girl on a cold January night and a man who had been certain and had been wrong in a different way than Greer had been wrong and had paid a price that no certainty could justify. He thought about his own certainty in Kandahar, about the particular feeling of knowing the way it sat in your chest, clean and solid, and how that feeling had been indistinguishable from truth until the moment it wasn't. He was not certain now. He was something else. He was determined. He was working towards something that might not succeed, building toward a possibility rather than a guarantee. And he knew the difference this time between those two things. The difference was the notebook, the measurements, the water in the cups, the cloth strips that had told him the truth without caring what he wanted to hear. Scout limped to him across the floor and lay down with his head on Greer's knee. The fire crackled. The storm pushed at the walls. Greer opened the notebook to the page where he had written Dex's name and looked at it for a long time. Then he turned to a fresh page and began drawing the next section of the plan. The fourth day began before light. Greer was already awake when the darkness outside shifted from black to the particular gray that comes just before a Colorado winter dawn, that colorless hour when the snow on the ground gives off more light than the sky above it. He had slept 4 hours on the floor beside the hearth, with his coat folded under his head and Scout pressed against his back, and 4 hours was enough. It had always been enough. He built the fire up from the coals and stood over it for a moment, letting the heat reach his face, then turned and looked at what the previous 3 days had made. The cabin looked like the inside of something being taken apart and rebuilt at the same time. The 2 trenches he had finished ran parallel beneath the floorboards in the western half of the room, their edges rough and dark against the pale wood. The first stone column was rising in the northwest corner, 3 feet high, now mortared carefully, each stone chosen for flatness and density. Tools lay across every flat surface. The notebook was open on the table to a page covered in angles and measurements. Dust from the mortar had settled over everything in a fine white layer that made the interior look ghostly in the firelight. Scout was awake. He had not put weight on the wrapped paw since the night before, but he moved around the cabin with the careful determination of an animal that has decided an injury is not a reason to stop paying attention. He made his morning circuit of the perimeter, nose close to the floor, checking each corner in turn. At the northwest corner, where the first column was rising, he stopped and sniffed the new mortar, and then sat back and looked at Greer with an expression that communicated something between assessment and approval. Greer poured water into the pot and waited for it to heat. He ate standing up, looking at the diagram pinned to the wall above the table. The plan called for 4 columns, 4 channels beneath the floor, and a central firebox that would sit where the old fireplace now stood, rebuilt from the ground up with the new geometry at its center. The old chimney would be taken down to the roofline and capped. The heat would no longer be allowed to rise straight up and escape. It would be divided, directed, sent outward through the channels and upward through the 4 corner columns, radiating from each one into the dead zones that had always been left to freeze. The logic was sound. He had checked it a dozen times. He had also checked it against what he did not know, which was the part that kept him careful. He was not an engineer. He understood heat behavior from years of field experience in environments where warmth was either available or it wasn't, and survival depended on knowing the difference. He had studied the physics in his notebook, the way he had studied mission maps, looking for the gaps, the places where his understanding ran out and something else would have to carry him through. He had circled 2 such places in red. The first was the joint where each channel connected to the central firebox. If the seal was not perfect, if there was any gap in the connection, gas could migrate into the floor cavity. He had sourced heat-resistant compound from Petra's store in the first purchase and had used it carefully, but carefully was not the same as certainly, and he knew it. The second was the draw balance between the 4 outlet columns. A chimney worked because hot air rose and pulled cooler air behind it. With 4 columns drawing from one source, the system needed to pull evenly. If one column drew harder than the others, the heat would favor that corner, and the opposite corner would be starved. He had calculated the column heights to equalize the draw, but calculation was not the same as reality, and he knew that too. He thought about these things while he ate, and then he put them in the part of his mind where problems went when they had been acknowledged and could not yet be solved, and he picked up the chisel and went to work on the second trench. By mid-morning, the cold inside the cabin was significant. The construction had required him to lift sections of the floorboard, and without the boards in place, the frozen earth beneath radiated cold upward in a way that the fire struggled to counter. Scout had moved himself to the chair closest to the hearth and sat in it with the dignity of a boy who has decided that if he cannot work, he will at least observe from a position of authority. Greer was on his knees in the trench when he heard boots on the porch. He did not stop working. He listened to the pattern of the steps, 2 people, one heavier than the other, moving without urgency. Then a knock on the door frame, and Croft Dunbar's voice coming through the wood. "Calloway, you in there?" Greer set down the chisel and stood up. He opened the door. Croft and Ledge Dunbar stood on the porch in their work coats, breath coming white in the cold air. They looked past Greer into the interior of the cabin with the undisguised curiosity of men who had expected to see something strange and were discovering that the reality exceeded their expectation. Croft said nothing for a full 3 seconds. Then he said, "Lord Almighty." Ledge looked at the trenches and the rising column and the tools on every surface and then looked at Greer with an expression that had moved past amusement into something closer to genuine uncertainty. "Vern told us you were building something," Ledge said. "He didn't say you were rebuilding the whole inside of your cabin in the middle of February." Greer stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, more a withdrawal of the obstacle. They came in. Scout watched them from the chair with calm, assessing eyes. He did not growl, he did not wag his tail. He simply watched in the way he watched everything, collecting information and reserving judgment. Croft walked slowly along the edge of the trench nearest the door, looking down into it. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet Greer could see him actually looking, not performing skepticism, but trying to understand what he was seeing. "You're running something under the floor," Croft said. "Channels," Greer said. "Heat from the central firebox moves through them to each corner column. Each column radiates outward." Ledge had moved to the northwest column and was looking at the mortar work. He put his hand against the stone and pressed, testing the solidity. He did not comment on it. "And the old chimney," Ledge said, "coming down to the roof line, being capped." Ledge turned and looked at him. He had the kind of face that did not perform reactions, and what was on it now was the careful blankness of a man working through a problem he has not finished working through. Croft said, "Vern thinks this is going to cause a fire." Greer said, "What do you think?" Croft looked at the trench again. He crossed his arms over his chest. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have never seen a man tear up his own floor in the middle of winter unless he had a very good reason or was completely out of his mind, and you don't seem out of your mind." Ledge said, "The corner over there." He pointed to the northwest column. "That where your friend was sleeping?" "Yes." Ledge looked at the column for a moment longer. Then he said, "I'm sorry about your friend, Dunn." It was simply said and simply meant, and Greer received it the same way. They stayed for another 10 minutes, not helping, not hindering, just present in the way that men sometimes are when they are not ready to commit to a position and are not willing to leave either. When they went, Croft paused at the door and looked back. "If you need anything moved or lifted," he said, "something you can't do by yourself." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. He left it there and walked out, and Ledge followed him, and Greer listened to their boots on the porch steps until they were gone. He went back to work. On the 8th day, he drove back down to Ridgecrest for the second time. He needed more of the heat-resistant compound and a longer section of the metal liner that would run inside the 4th channel. He also needed more stone mortar. He had calculated the quantities carefully before the first trip and had been wrong by more than he expected, which meant either his calculations had an error or the work was consuming more material than the plan called for. He had found the error on the 6th day, a column dimension he had written in the notebook as 14 inches that should have been 16, and the correction had cascaded through 4 other measurements and required him to remortar a section of the 2nd column he had already finished. He had done it without anger. Errors in construction were like errors in planning. They were information. They told you something the original estimate had not known, and the correct response to information was to use it, not to regret it. He parked in front of Petra's store and went in. Petra was behind the counter. 2 other people were in the store. A rancher Greer did not know by name browsing the back section, and a woman in her 60s looking at seed catalogs near the window. Neither of them looked up. Greer put his list on the counter. Petra looked at it. She looked at it for longer than a list of 4 items required. Then she said, "Greer, I need to talk to you about something." She came around the counter and gestured toward the back, past the shelving units, toward the door that led into the stockroom. He followed her through it. The stockroom smelled of sawdust and machine oil and the particular cold of a room that shares a wall with the outside. Boxes of hardware were stacked on metal shelving along both walls. A space heater in the corner was doing modest work against the chill. Petra turned to face him. She said, "Vern Brimslow came to see me yesterday." Greer waited. "He asked me not to fill any more orders for the materials you've been buying," she said. She met his eyes steadily. He did not say it as a threat, and he did not make demands. He just told me what he told me and asked me to think about it. And I have thought about it. Greer said nothing. Petra looked at him for a moment. She was not a cruel woman. He had always understood that about her. She was a practical woman in a small town who had learned that her position in the community depended on navigating relationships carefully, and Vern Brimslow was a relationship that 30 years of other relationships depended on. He has 30 years of trust in this valley, she said. And you have been here 2 years and you keep mostly to yourself. And I don't know enough about what you're building to be sure it's safe. And he lost family, Greer. He lost family to something that sounds like what you're describing. Greer said Dex Paulson died in my cabin, in a cabin that had a fire burning. He was 6 feet from the flames and the corner where he slept was below freezing. Petra was quiet. Greer said, what I'm building is not what Vern's brother built. What Vern's brother built was left unfinished. What I am building will be finished before I run a fire through it. I am not building in a hurry, and I am not building on certainty. I am building on measurements. Petra looked at the list on the counter between them. I know you have to make a choice, Greer said. I'm not going to argue with it. He turned and walked back through the store and out the front door. He sat in his truck for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Then he drove to the hardware store in the next town 40 minutes down the mountain road and bought what he needed there. He also bought 2 additional sections of metal liner he had not originally planned for because the drive had given him time to think about the draw balance problem again, and he had arrived at a solution that required more material than the original plan. On the drive back up with the boxes in the bed of the truck and the snow coming light and steady against the windshield, he felt the particular calm of a man who has been opposed and has not been stopped. He got back to the cabin as the light was failing. Scout was waiting at the door. The dog had moved from the chair at some point during the day and was sitting precisely at the threshold with his wrapped paw held slightly off the ground and an expression that conveyed both relief at Greer's return and mild reproach at the length of his absence. Greer brought the supplies inside and set them on the table. Then he saw the sack near the door. It was a canvas bag, the kind used for carrying stones or sand, and it was sitting against the outside wall just to the left of the door frame where he would have walked past it in the dark if Scout had not been sitting directly adjacent to it. He picked it up. It was heavy. He opened the top and looked inside. Stones, good ones, flat-faced granite pieces, the kind that came from the creek bed half a mile east, the kind he had been sourcing himself by hand on the days when he needed material and had no other option. Someone had gathered them and brought them here and left them without knocking. No note, no name. Scout was watching him from beside the door. When Greer looked at the boy, Scout turned his head and looked in the direction of the Brimslow property clearly and deliberately, and then looked back at Greer. Greer stood in the cold doorway with the bag in his hands. This had happened today. After Petra had told Vern's position. After Vern had made his position clear to the whole town. Someone in the Brimslow household had gathered a bag of creek stones and carried them up the hill and left them at his door without a word. He did not go looking for an explanation. He carried the bag inside, set it beside the second trench, and went back to work. On the 11th day, he attempted the first full test of the system. 3 of the 4 columns were complete. The 4th was 2 courses of stone short of its final height, but complete enough to function. The channels beneath the floor were sealed. The central firebox had been rebuilt entirely from the foundation up its geometry, precise to the notebook drawings, its joints packed with heat-resistant compound that had been allowed to cure for 48 hours before he touched fire to anything. He had checked every connection 3 times. He had used strips of cloth to verify airflow in each channel before sealing the floor sections back into place. He had spent an entire evening doing nothing but looking at what he had built from every angle, looking for the things he did not want to find. Then he built a fire, small at first. A careful fire fed slowly from a small pile of dry wood he had set aside specifically for this test. He knelt in front of the central firebox opening and watched the flame take hold, watched it spread across the kindling, watched the first thin thread of smoke rise and find the geometry of the firebox above it. Scout was sitting 4 feet behind him, perfectly still. The smoke curled upward inside the firebox, rose to the distribution point at the top and then separated. Greer watched it happen, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. The smoke simply reached the junction and divided 2 threads going left, two going right, each finding its channel and moving into it with the quiet inevitability of water finding the lowest point. It disappeared into the channels, and the cabin filled with the sound of a fire burning in a way it had not burned before, a lower note to it, a distributed hum, rather than the concentrated roar of a single chimney. Greer put his hand near the northwest column. Cold stone. He waited. Scout got up and walked to the northeast corner and sat down facing the column there. Greer moved to that column, still cold. He went back to the firebox and added more wood. The fire built. He could feel it in the room, the warmth spreading in a different pattern than before, less vertical, less concentrated. He moved slowly around the perimeter, one hand extended toward each column in turn. Then the northeast column changed. It was subtle, not heat exactly, not yet, but the absolute cold was gone from the surface, replaced by something neutral, something that was neither warm nor cold, but was demonstrably different from what had been there before. Scout was still sitting in front of that column. His tail moved once. The northwest column followed, then the southwest, and then the southeast column did not change. Greer crouched in front of it and pressed his palm flat against the stone. Cold, not neutral, cold. The same dead zone cold that had been there since the first morning he had put his hand against an interior wall and felt something wrong. Scout appeared beside him and sniffed the column from base to the highest stone he could reach, and then he walked in a slow circle around the base and stopped and scraped his paw against the floor in the corner where the column met the boards. Greer got down on his knees. He pressed his face close to the base of the column and looked at the joint where the channel opening met the stone foundation. In the dim firelight, it looked solid. He ran his fingers along the seam. There, a gap the width of a finger, almost nothing but in the wrong place. Not a dangerous gap, not a gap that would allow gas to reach timber, but a gap at the entry point of the channel that was allowing the moving air to bypass the column, entirely escaping back into the floor cavity, rather than rising through the stone. The channel was sealed correctly everywhere except this one point, and this one point was enough to starve the entire southeast column of its heat source. He sat back and looked at Scout. The dog looked back at him with calm gold eyes. Greer said, "Good boy." He worked for the next 4 hours in the dark with a lantern positioned at floor level, mixing a small batch of compound by hand, applying it to the gap in careful layers, working it into the seam with his fingers, until his hands were white with cold, and the compound was uniformly smooth and the gap was gone. He let it cure overnight. The next morning he built the fire again. He added wood at the same rate as before and crouched in front of the central firebox and watched the smoke divide and disappear into the channels and said nothing and waited. Scout walked directly to the southeast column and sat in front of it. 3 minutes passed, then Scout's tail began to move. Greer crossed the room and put his hand against the southeast stone. Warm. Not the warmth of a fire that you are standing next to, something different. Something that came from within the stone itself, radiating outward in all directions, into the corner, into the air, into the dead zone that had existed in that space since the cabin was built, and perhaps since before that. He moved to each column in turn. Warm, 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 warm. He stood in the center of the cabin and turned slowly, feeling the air around him, and what he felt was even. Not perfect, not identical in every cubic foot, but even in the way that mattered, the way that meant no corner of this room would ever again be allowed to fall to the temperature of the outside world, while a fire burned at the center of it. He went to the northwest corner. He walked to it directly, not testing the air with his hand first, just walking to the place where Dex Paulson had slept and had not woken up. And he stood in it and looked at the wall. The logs there were dry. No ice, no frost crystals. The wood was cool to the touch, but it was wood cool, not stone cold, not the deep penetrating wrongness that had been there every time he had touched it for the past 2 weeks. He put his back against the corner and slid down until he was sitting on the floor. Scout came and lay down beside him, his shoulder against Greer's wing, his wrapped paw extended in front of him. The fire crackled at the center of the cabin. All 4 columns breathed their quiet warmth into the corners of the room. Greer opened the notebook. He looked at the page where he had written Dex Paulson's name on the second day, and below it the words, "I'm going to find out how to stop this." He took the pen from his shirt pocket. He wrote below it, "I did." Then he closed the notebook and set it on the floor beside him and leaned his head back against the warm log wall of the northwest corner and closed his eyes. Scout sighed a long, slow exhale of a dog at rest. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with the ordinary sound of wind that is not threatening anything, just passing through, just doing what wind does when there is nothing to destroy and nowhere particular to be. Greer sat in the corner that had taken his friend and let the warmth of what he had built hold him, and for the first time and longer than he could accurately remember, the silence inside the cabin was not the silence of a man waiting for the next thing to go wrong. It was simply quiet. He did not sleep there. He sat for perhaps 20 minutes, long enough for the warmth to become something he could believe in rather than just measure, and then he stood and began planning the next phase of what needed to be done. There were 11 other cabins within 4 miles of his position that he knew of. He had no way of knowing which of them had the same dead zone problem. He had no way of knowing if anyone else in the Ridgecrest Valley had lost someone to a cold corner and attributed it to something else, to age, to illness, to the ordinary and accepted cruelty of mountain winters. He thought it was likely. He thought it was likely that Dex was not the first. He also knew that the version of himself that existed 3 weeks ago, the version that had come to this plateau specifically to make no decisions that affected other people, would have let that thought sit and done nothing with it. He looked at Scout. Scout looked back. Greer picked up the chisel from the floor and turned it over in his hands. The 4 columns stood in their corners, breathing heat into a room that had never been fully warmed before. He thought about what it would take to help someone else build this. What it would require him to do to go down to Ridgecrest to talk to people who had laughed at him and opposed him and refused to sell him materials to make himself available to a community that had not asked for him. He thought about Vern Brimslow, standing in a parking lot in the cold, telling a story about a 4-year-old girl, and a January fire, telling it with the particular precision of a man who has recited it to himself so many times that the words have worn smooth. He thought about the bag of creek stones at his door with no name attached. He set the chisel down on the table. He picked up the notebook and turned to a fresh page. He wrote the word plan at the top. Then he began. 3 days after the system held its first full burn, the weather radio on the shelf above the door began speaking in a tone that Greer recognized. Not the routine advisory voice, measured and procedural, the voice of a system reporting conditions that fell within the expected range of mountain winter. This was the other voice, the one that carried a particular flatness, as though the person recording it had understood that the information they were conveying exceeded the capacity of ordinary language to adequately prepare anyone for it. Arctic front moving through the southern Rockies. Temperatures expected to reach 38 below zero at elevation. Wind chill values approaching 60 below in exposed areas. Residents are advised to remain indoors. This is not a storm to be outside in. Greer listened to it twice. Then he checked the firebox, added a full load of seasoned wood, adjusted the draw on the 2 columns that pulled slightly harder than the others, and stood in the center of the cabin while the warmth moved outward from all 4 corners, with the steady, even patience of something that had finally been given the right conditions to do what it was designed to do. The temperature outside dropped through the afternoon with a speed that felt aggressive, as though the cold had somewhere to be and intended to arrive there without delay. By 4 o'clock, the windows were frosted so completely that the glass had become opaque white and crystalline from edge to edge, and the light inside the cabin had taken on the particular quality of light inside a lantern contained intimate, slightly gold. Scout was not sleeping. This was notable. Scout slept well and deeply in the evenings, curled in a tight shape near the warmest column, his breathing slow and his ears at rest. But tonight he was awake and had been awake since mid-afternoon, sitting with his back to the firebox and his face toward the front wall of the cabin, his eyes moving in small, careful arcs across the room without settling anywhere. Greer watched him. He had learned to read Scout the way he had learned to read terrain, not by cataloging specific signals and matching them to a reference list, but by developing a feel for the animal's baseline and noting when something deviated from it. Scout's baseline in the evenings was stillness and rest. What he was doing now was neither of those things, and what it was instead did not have a precise name, but had a weight to it that Greer took seriously. He added another log to the firebox and checked the temperature gauge near the door. Outside, 31 below and falling. Inside, 54 degrees, even consistent across all 4 corners, the warmest the cabin had been since he bought it. He sat in the chair by the table and opened the notebook and reviewed the plan he had started 3 days ago, the one that had grown over those 3 days from a single page of rough notes into something more detailed and more considered. He had drawn diagrams of 4 neighboring cabins based on what he could observe from the outside, estimating their internal dimensions and identifying the likely locations of their dead zones. He had written a list of materials that each retrofit would require. He had written a list of questions he would need to ask each owner before he could be useful to them. He was working on the 3rd cabin diagram when Scout stood up, not gradually. All at once, the way Scout moved when something external had crossed a threshold that mattered. The dog was on his feet and facing the front door before Greer had fully registered the change, and then a second later, Greer heard what Scout had heard first. Sound in the wind, not the wind itself. Something inside it irregular and human, and faint enough that in any other context he might have dismissed it as the cabin settling or a branch coming down under snow load. He did not dismiss it. He was at the door in 4 steps. He pulled it open and the cold hit him like a wall, a physical force that stole the breath from his lungs and replaced it with something that felt like breathing ground glass. The wind was moving hard from the northwest, driving snow horizontally across the clearing in front of the cabin, and the darkness beyond the porch railing was absolute. Scout pushed past him onto the porch and stood with his nose extended into the wind. Then Greer heard it again. Not wind, a voice. Broken up and stripped of its consonants by distance and cold, but unmistakably human and unmistakably in distress. He went back inside for the lantern and his kiddo and his gloves, put all 3 on faster than he had dressed for anything since he left the service, and came back out. Scout was already off the porch and moving toward the tree line, testing the snow with each step on his 3 good legs, and the one wrapped paw moving with the careful deliberateness of an animal navigating terrain it is not certain of. Greer followed the lantern's reach into the dark. He found Vern Brimslow, 60 yards from the cabin, on his knees in knee-deep snow, one arm hooked around the base of a pine tree, as though the tree was the only thing with an opinion about whether he stayed vertical. His beard was white with ice. His coat was the work coat he wore around his property, heavy canvas, but not the insulated gear a man should have on in 30 below wind chill. His eyes were open, but the focus in them was intermittent, coming and going like a signal from a long distance. Greer was beside him before the thought of not going was fully formed. He got his arm around Vern's back and pulled the man's weight against his own body, and felt how cold he was, not through layers of clothing, but radiating from him the specific cold of someone whose core temperature had been losing ground for hours. He said Vern's name. Vern's eyes found him. Something in them shifted recognition coming through the fog. He said one word clearly. Adelkinon. Then he said house, and then he said fire, and then his jaw was shaking too hard for more words. Greer said your cabin. The man's head moved in something that was meant to be a nod. Greer said, since when? Vern tried to answer and could not get it organized. He held up his hand with 3 fingers extended and then dropped the hand. 3 hours, Greer thought. Maybe more. Maybe since early afternoon when the temperature had started its fast descent. He looked at Scout. The dog was standing 2 feet away, watching Vern with the same careful attention he gave everything. And then he looked at Greer, and then he looked toward the cabin, and the meaning of it was plain. Greer got Vern upright. It took longer than it should have because Vern's legs were not reliable, and the snow was deep, and the wind was doing everything it could to be an obstacle. He half carried the man across the 60 yards through the porch door and into the cabin, and when the warmth from the 4 columns reached them both, it was like being lifted. He got Vern to the floor beside the south column and layered blankets over him and checked his hands and his ears and the color coming back or not coming back into his face. His pulse was there, weak but present, and after 4 minutes of warmth and stillness, the shaking in his jaw began to ease and his eyes stayed focused for longer intervals. Greer crouched in front of him. He said, I have to go get her. Vern looked at him. The full understanding of what that meant crossed the man's face, slowly arriving in stages. And when it arrived completely, his expression did something that men his age do not often do in front of other people. Greer put his hand briefly on Vern's shoulder. Then he stood and looked at Scout. The dog was already at the door. The Brimslow property was 8 miles down the valley road. In ordinary conditions, it was a 20-minute drive. The road tonight was not drivable. The snow had drifted across it in the hours since the front arrived, and what was visible of the surface was ice over frozen ruts that would put a truck in the ditch before the first mile was done. The trail that ran parallel to the road through the timber was narrower and longer, but navigable on foot, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the tree cover. 8 miles in 38 below zero with a wind chill approaching 60 below. He did not think about it as a whole. He thought about the first 100 yards, which was enough to occupy the part of his mind that was responsible for doubt. And then, when the first 100 yards were behind him, he thought about the next 100 yards, and this was how he had always moved through things that the whole view of would have been paralyzing. Scout led. This was not a decision Greer made. Scout simply went first, moving along the trail with his nose close to the surface, reading what the snow had covered, finding the path by some combination of memory and sense that Greer could not replicate, but was deeply grateful for. The dog's wrapped paw left a slightly different impression in the snow than the other three, a shallower track, and Greer watched those tracks and placed his feet carefully and kept moving. The wind in the timber was reduced but not absent. It moved through the high branches above them in waves, and every wave brought a new fall of loose snow down through the canopy, and the temperature in the shelter of the trees was perhaps 5 degrees warmer than in the open, which was the difference between conditions that were merely brutal and conditions that were incompatible with extended survival. Greer had dressed for this correctly. He had spent 11 years operating in environments that wanted to kill him, and he knew how to layer, and he had done so before leaving the cabin, 3 base layers, and the heavy insulated outer shell, and the face covering that left only his eyes exposed. He was generating heat through movement, and the movement was continuous, and he was managing it. Scout was managing differently. The dog's coat was designed for cold, and he moved through it with the particular efficiency of an animal built for this terrain. But the wrapped paw was a liability in the deep snow, and Greer could see it in the way the dog adjusted his gait, compensating and redistributing, pushing through what must have been significant pain with an equanimity that was either brave or simply unself-conscious. Greer thought it was both. An hour into the walk, the trail crossed an open meadow where the wind had its full reach, and the cold descended on them with a completeness that was almost structural, as though the air itself had become a solid thing, pressing from all directions simultaneously. Greer lowered his head and drove his legs and counted steps in sets of 50, a technique from training something to put between his mind and the full reality of conditions until the conditions changed. Scout stayed close during the meadow crossing, not leading at his normal distance of 10 or 15 feet ahead, but within arm's reach, close enough that Greer could have touched him without extending his arm. He was not doing it for navigation. He was doing it the way he had pressed against Greer's leg on the porch in the dark on the morning. All of this began just a warm thing staying near, because warmth mattered, and so did proximity. They came through the far side of the meadow into timber again, and Greer exhaled and kept walking. 2 hours and Scout stopped. Greer stopped beside him and looked ahead. Through the trees, maybe 300 yards further along the trail, there was a darkness that was different from the surrounding darkness, the rectangular darkness of a structure, and no light in any window, and no smoke from the chimney. He started moving faster. The cabin door was not frozen shut, but it was close. The latch mechanism had seized, and it took him 2 full minutes, and the heel of his boot applied twice to the lower frame before it gave. He pushed inside, and the cold that came out to meet him was the cold of outside indistinguishable, a space that had not been warmer than the air around it for hours. The fireplace held gray ash. Scout moved past him into the cabin, nose down, moving him past in a direct line, not exploring, going somewhere specific, and he stopped in the far corner near the fireplace where Adele Brimslow lay on the floor with 2 blankets pulled over her, and a third one she had apparently been reaching for when she lost consciousness draped half across her outstretched arm. Greer was beside her reindeer before Scout had finished his first assessment sniff. He pressed his fingers to her neck. He held them there, faint, slow, but present. He worked without rushing, which was not the same as working slowly. Rushing with hypothermia was how you killed someone whose body was already doing everything in its power to keep itself alive. He knew the sequence, had known it since field medicine training, and had used it in conditions not entirely unlike these: the gradual rewarming, the careful insulation from the outside in the management of the airway, the monitoring of the pulse for the changes that told you which direction things were moving. He wrapped her in everything available that was dry. He used his own body heat, deliberately positioning himself to block the draft from the door he had left ajar for Scout to move through. He talked to her in a low, steady voice, not because he believed she could hear him, but because it was something to do with his breath that was not panic. Scout lay down against her legs and stayed there. The dog's body temperature was not nothing. It was something. Every degree helped. After 15 minutes, her breathing changed, became slightly deeper, slightly more deliberate. A few minutes after that, her hands moved not purposefully, but reflexively, the small unconscious movements of a body beginning to return to itself. Greer said her name. Her eyes opened partway, not focused, seeing something interior rather than exterior. He said her name again. She turned her head toward the sound. He said, "I'm going to take you to my cabin. Vern is there, he's okay." Her lips moved. Nothing came out for a moment. Then she said, cold in the voice of someone identifying something that has become the whole of their experience. "Yes," he said, "I know. We're going to fix that." He got her upright, slowly supporting her weight entirely, letting her legs find what purchase they could without demanding it of them. Scout moved to her other side and leaned against her hip, a counterbalance, a warm anchor. Carrying her was different from walking out alone. Greer was aware of every calculation the trail required, the footing in the deep snow, the angle of descent across the meadow, the places where the path crossed frozen water that would not necessarily hold two people's weight. He moved carefully, and he moved continuously, and he did not stop. Scout led. In the open meadow, the wind hit them, and Greer felt Adele flinch against him, the involuntary muscular response of a body registering threat, and he pulled her closer and dropped his head and kept his legs moving. He did not count steps this time. He thought about the 4 columns. He thought about the warmth waiting at the other end of this walk, the warmth he had built stone by stone and measurement by measurement in the weeks since he sat beside his friend in a cold corner and asked himself a question he was not willing to leave unanswered. He thought about Dex Paulson folding his coat with the same precision he used for everything, carefully without thinking, just because that was how he had always done things. He thought about 2 men in a building in Kandahar and the decision he had made and what it had cost, and the 8 years he had spent since then trying to find the shape of a life that could contain that weight without being defined by it. He thought about the notebook, about the word plan written at the top of a fresh page 3 days ago, the word that had surprised him slightly when he wrote it, because planning for other people's benefit was something he had decided he was finished with, and then he had written it anyway because Scout had been watching him, and the warmth from the 4 columns had been moving evenly through the room, and some decisions make themselves if you wait long enough. 3 hours after leaving his cabin, Greer came through the tree line into the clearing and saw the glow from his windows, warm and steady, visible through the frost, a light that looked nothing like a fire confined to one side of a room, and everything like a fire that had been given enough room to do what fire is supposed to do. Scout barked, once sharp, triumphant. Greer got Adele through the door. The warmth came from all 4 corners simultaneously, and she made a sound when it reached her, involuntary and small, the sound of a body understanding that it has been brought back from a long way out. Vern was on the floor where Greer had left him, sitting up now. The blankets around his shoulders, the color returned to his face in a way that confirmed his core temperature had recovered. When he saw Adele come through the door, his face did something that Greer looked away from, not because it was uncomfortable to witness, but because it was private, and it was the most private kind of moment, the moment when something you thought you might have lost comes back. Greer laid Adele near the south column, which was running warmest at this hour, and continued the warming process with the same measured pace he had used in the Brimslow cabin. Scout took his position at her feet without being asked. Vern moved to her side and held her hand with both of his and did not speak. After 40 minutes, she was fully conscious, and her temperature was rising steadily, and the color in her face had shifted from the gray-white of serious hypothermia to something closer to its natural tone. She looked at Greer. She said, "You walked here." He said, "Scout helped." She looked at the dog. Scout's tail moved. She said, 8 miles. In that, Greer said, closer to 9 by the trail. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the 4 columns, at the warmth coming from each corner, at the even heat that filled the room from edge to edge. She said, "I can feel it from everywhere." "Yes," Greer said. She said, "It's not coming from just the fire." "No," he said, "not anymore." The cabin was quiet for a while except for the sound of the firebox and the wind outside and the particular hum that the system made when it was running well, a low harmonic that you felt more than heard the sound of heat being moved through stone in the way it was meant to be moved. Then Vern said something. He said it to the floor in front of him, not to Greer, in the voice of a man delivering a statement he has been composing for a long time without being sure he would ever have occasion to deliver it. He said, "My brother's system wasn't wrong." Greer waited. Vern said, "He had the right idea. Different from yours, but the direction was right. He'd gotten most of it built, and what he had was working. I went up to help him in January, and I looked at the unfinished sections, and I got afraid. I told him he should shut it down until spring. I told him to damp the fire and leave the system cold until the rest of the seals were in place." He stopped. Then he said, "He did what I told him. When you damp a system that's been running hot and leave channels unsealed, the contraction cracks things. Joints that were holding under heat let go when they cool fast. He didn't know that. I didn't know it either. We found out later after. One of the channel joints cracked overnight, and when he tried to start the system again in the morning, a spark found the gap and found the timber below the floor." Vern's hands were still around Adele's. He said, "I told everyone it was the design that failed. Because if the design failed, it was nobody's fault, and his idea was just wrong, and there was nothing to learn from it, and nothing anyone could have done differently. That was easier than the other thing." "The other thing," Greer said. "Then knowing I gave the instruction that killed them," Vern said. Greer sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "I gave an instruction in Kandahar, a building I ordered my team into. I had seen two things that made me uncertain, and I looked at them and decided I knew better than what I was seeing. Two of my people didn't come home." Vern looked at him for the first time since he had started talking. Greer said, "I bought this cabin so I would stop being in a position to give instructions. So I couldn't be the reason for anything that happened to anyone. And then Dex came to stay and died 6 feet from a fire I had burning. Vern said, 'You still came out tonight.' Greer said, 'Scout didn't give me a different option.'" Scout's tail moved once from his position at Adele's feet. Adele said quietly, "He never does." They sat in the warmth of the four corners for a long time after that, the two men and the woman while the storm outside did what it was going to do regardless of what any of them thought about it. The wind pressed at the walls, the temperature continued to fall, and inside the cabin the heat moved evenly and continuously from the central firebox out through the channels and up through the stone columns and into every corner of the room, finding the places that had always been abandoned to cold and refusing to leave them that way. In the morning the storm had not fully passed, but it had exhausted the most violent part of itself, and what remained was cold and snow, without the wind's particular malice. Greer checked on both of them through the night, maintaining the firebox, adding wood at intervals, monitoring Adele's recovery with the attention of someone who had seen what the alternative looked like and was not going to allow inattention to be a variable. By dawn, she was sitting up and asking for water and making observations about the cabin's interior with the precise attention of a woman who had spent 30 years keeping a household running in mountain conditions and recognized immediately when something had been done well. She said 4 columns, one for each corner. "Yes," Greer said. She said, "and the floor, channels beneath it. Heat moves through them from the center out." She looked at the nearest column for a moment. Then she said, "Vern and I have been in our cabin for 22 years. The southeast corner has been cold every winter. We put an extra rug there and we didn't go near it at night." Greer nodded. She said, "Our grandchildren sleep in that corner when they visit." The room was quiet. She said, "When can you show us how to build this?" Vern said her name, a single syllable, carrying the weight of everything he had said the night before and everything he had not said in the 20 years before that. She looked at her husband. She said, "That corner has been cold for 22 years. I want it warm before next winter." Vern looked at Greer. Greer said, "I'll come down when the road clears." He walked them out 2 days later when the road had been made passable, following their truck down the mountain in his own to make sure they reached the valley without incident. Scout rode in the passenger seat and watched the road with the focused attention of a dog who has decided that vigilance is a form of affection. When they reached Ridgecrest, Vern stopped his truck in front of Petra Owens' store. He went inside. Greer waited in his truck and watched through the store window as Vern spoke to Petra for a few minutes, and then Petra looked out through the glass at Greer's truck, and then she nodded, and then Vern came back out. He knocked on Greer's window. Greer rolled it down. Vern said, "She wants to know if you'll come in." Greer looked at the store for a moment. Then he got out of the truck. Petra was standing behind her counter when he came in, and the expression on her face was not one he had seen on her before. Not the efficient neutrality she had offered him every previous time he had walked through the door. Something more effortful than that. Something that cost her something to wear. She said, "I should have filled your second order." He said, "You made the decision that made sense to you with what you knew." She said, "I knew enough." She looked at her counter. "I'll supply the materials for the first 3 families that want to build this. No charge." He said, "That's generous." She said, "It's what I can do." He said, "It's enough." Within 2 weeks of the storm, Greer had spoken to 9 families in the valley. He went to each cabin himself, walking through the interior, with Scout watching the dog move from corner to corner, and noting where Scout's nose dropped and his pace slowed, reading the cabin's thermal behavior, the way the dog had taught him to read it through presence and attention rather than instruments. Every cabin had at least 2 dead zones. Most had 3. 2 had 4 corners that tested as severely cold as the northwest corner of Greer's own cabin had been before the rebuild, which meant that in 2 houses in Ridgecrest, every corner was a place where a person should not sleep on a cold night. He did not say this to alarm anyone. He said it to inform them, and the difference was in the way he said it, plainly and with the specific details that allowed a person to understand rather than just fear. He had learned that distinction in the field, the difference between reporting conditions in a way that created panic and reporting them in a way that created response. Panic was useless. Response was everything. Croft and Ledge Dunbar were the first to build. They showed up at Greer's cabin on a Tuesday morning with their own tools and a truck bed full of stone from the creek and asked him to walk them through it from the beginning. He did. They worked for 4 days and asked good questions and made 2 mistakes and caught one of those mistakes themselves before Greer noticed it, which was a sign that they were actually understanding the system rather than just following instructions. When they ran their first test burn and felt the southeast column of their cabin come to life for the first time, Croft stood with his hand against the stone for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Our mother used to sleep in that corner." Ledge said, "I know." They did not say anything else about it. Scout spent those weeks doing what he had done in Greer's cabin, moving through each structure being worked on, checking the progress, identifying the gaps and the misalignments in the places where the work was close but not finished. He did this with the quiet efficiency of an animal who has found a purpose that matches his nature, and the people whose houses he moved through accepted his assessments with a seriousness that would have surprised anyone who had not watched him work. Petra told Greer one afternoon that the valley was starting to call Scout the inspector. Greer said he's better at it than most inspectors. She said he is. By the time the deep cold released its grip on Ridgecrest and the first suggestions of spring began to appear in the lower elevations, 11 cabins in the valley had been retrofitted or were in the process of being retrofitted. 3 more families from farther along the valley road had driven up to ask questions after hearing about it from neighbors. Greer kept a running list in the notebook. He answered every question the same way he had answered the questions at his own design, by going back to first principles, by starting with what he'd actually did in a confined space and working outward from there, and by being honest about the places where he was certain and the places where he was still learning. He was still learning. That was something he had come to understand during those weeks in a way he had not fully understood before, that learning and certainty were not the same thing, and that the most dangerous version of any expertise was the version that had stopped distinguishing between them. He drove up to the ridge on a morning in late March when the snow had pulled back from the lower slopes and the sky was the deep, unhesitating blue that appears over Colorado in the pause between winter and everything that comes after it. He parked the truck where the trail crested the hill above town and got out, and Scout got out, and they walked to the place where the ridge gave a clear view down into the valley. Ridgecrest below them was quiet and ordinary, in the way of small mountain towns in early spring. Wood smoke from Chimney's trucks moving slowly on the main road, the long shadows of the eastern ridge beginning to pull back as the sun climbed. He counted the chimneys, the ones that had been there before, single-stack central efficient in their limited way, and the new ones, the corner columns rising from the retrofitted cabins, 4 per structure, visible from this distance, as a different profile against the sky, a broader stance. A quieter smoke because the system distributed the draw rather than concentrating it. He could see 8 of them from where he stood. 8 cabins that were different inside than they had been 3 months ago. 8 sets of corners that would not be abandoned next winter. Scout sat beside him and looked down at the valley. From somewhere below, a sound came up through the cold air, children in the yard of one of the closer properties, their voices thin and clear at this distance. One of them shouted something Greer could not fully make out. Then another voice, older, a parent maybe, said something in response, and a word came through the morning air cleanly enough to reach the ridge. The word was warm. Greer put his hand on Scout's head. The dog leaned slightly into the pressure of the touch, the same slight lean he always offered, not needy, not demonstrative, just present, just the weight of one creature, allowing another to know it was there. Greer said, Dex would have wanted to see this. Scout's tail moved. He said he would have had opinions about the stonework. He always had opinions about stonework. The tail moved again. Greer looked down at the valley for another minute. At the chimneys, at the smoke rising from them in slow, parallel lines into the blue Colorado morning. At the structures that now held warmth in their corners, the way structures should always have held it, not as something confined to the center and lost at the edges, but as something that moved and reached and found the places that needed it. He was not certain he had done enough. He was not certain the question of enough was one that ever fully resolved for a person who had been the reason for something irreversible. He thought it probably didn't. He thought the most honest thing he could say about it was that he had found something worth doing and had done it as well as he knew how, and that the doing of it had not brought back anyone he had lost, but had perhaps made it so that losing them was not entirely the end of the sentence. He thought that might have to be sufficient. He looked at Scout. Scout looked back at him with those pale gold eyes that had been reading him accurately since the first day in the shelter in Colorado Springs, when the dog had sized him up from the back of the last kennel and apparently found him acceptable, or at least interesting enough to take a chance on. Greer said, let's go home. They walked back to the truck together, the man and the dog, through the last of the winter snow that was still clinging to the high ground, their tracks going side by side and neither of them in front of the other.